Okay, this week's lecture is on Yugoslavia. And before I begin, I wanted to say just one thing, and that is that you may or may not have noticed, or may not know, that in addition to teaching Fractured Continent at the university, I'm also teaching a module on the conflicts in the Balkans in the 1990s, which is about a module which is about this a course which is about which is exactly the same size as Fractured Continent, but deals exclusively with the wars of independence, with the end of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. So if you go to the YouTube channel that I've set up for for this module, you'll see that there's another selection of videos called "Conflict in the Balkans," and there's an expanding number of online lectures which I'm giving for that module. So if this is a topic that you're interested in, I'll speak very briefly about it today, and there is also the reading, of course, by Kathy Carmichael. I'm also going to post, I also have posted on Moodle, links to a very good BBC documentary which was broadcast in 1996 in 6 episodes, each 1 hour long, and includes a very informative, very clear description of what is happening or what happened in Yugoslavia during the conflicts in the 1990s. But it also includes some very good interviews with the protagonists of this drama, of this collapse. And so that's also a very useful source, which, as I say, I've linked onto the website. So we'll talk briefly about it today, but if you're interested in more information on Yugoslavia, I would urge you to sort of flip the channel and have a look at some of the videos that I've been posting online on the YouTube channel for that course, and that will give you a much more detailed description of what is happening, and those are public, and those are also accessible. Okay, so let's have a look at slide one. Let's start with slide one. Now, Yugoslavia, there's a couple of things we need to know to understand what happened when Yugoslavia broke up. I guess if we think back to last session, when we talked about 1989, I told you that the end of communism was a very quick process, happened throughout the bloc very quickly, and it was a non-violent process. In almost all countries, virtually no casualties, with the notable exception, the important exception of Ceausescu's Romania, where we saw many hundreds of people were killed in this kind of confused desperation of Ceausescu trying to hold on, trying to cling on to power. Now, the exception, the other notable exception, was Yugoslavia. The country became communist at the end of the Second World War. But it also ended in violence in the 1990s. The end of communism ushered in a series of ethno-nationalist wars, which broke up the country and caused the deaths of over 100,000 people. Many of them, most of them, in fact, in the most violent conflict, which was in the heart of the country in Bosnia. Now, what differentiated Yugoslavia from the other communist bloc was a few things. If we move to slide number 2, there is a map of Cold War Europe. And you can see in the east, we have the Eastern Bloc, the countries that we've been talking about in a few of our previous sessions. And in the west, we have the Western Bloc. How did they get their names? Who knows? Countries like West Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, United Kingdom, France, and so on. Now, there was a third group, if you like, of so-called non-aligned states, and Yugoslavia was one of them. It had become communist at the end of the Second World War, but it had always been, or at least from a very early stage, it had been outside of the sphere of interest of the Soviet Union. The communist leadership in Yugoslavia had broke with the communist leadership in the Soviet Union in 1948. They had remained in power despite Stalin's attempts to remove them with force. and they had, as a result, sort of forged, off in their own direction. They had become what was known as a non-aligned state, and it was not unusual in the Cold War for communist countries to fall out, although they were sort of all adherents of Marxist, Leninist principles. Nevertheless, there was a lot of grounds for dispute, as there very often is amongst left-wing political groups and political states. The Chinese, the Sino-Soviet split, the split between China and the Soviet Union would be of course the most consequential, the most important one. But there was also a split between Yugoslavia. Now, Yugoslavia was rather a more complicated state than other parts of Europe. At the end of the Cold War, because of the Holocaust, because of population transfers, because of mass killings, and all of these terrible things that had happened in Europe during the Second World War, most of the states that emerged at the end of the Second World War were quite ethnically homogenous. An example of this would be a country like Poland, which before the Second World War was very multi-ethnic, had about 66% of the population were Polish, and the remainder were made up of course, Polish Jews, many of whom considered themselves to be Poles first and foremost. Also Ukrainians, Slovaks, various Germans, various other nationalities. The same would have been true of a country like Czechoslovakia, which up until the end of the Second World War, as many of you will know, had a very large German minority living in the so-called Sudetenlands, the western parts, mainly in the western parts and the northern parts of Czechoslovakia. And they were all removed, of course, at the end of the Second World War. Poland's borders were removed, so it discounted, it did not include the very large numbers of Ukrainians. So the maps changed very drastically, and the interior of these countries changed as well. That was not the case in Yugoslavia. There had been the Holocaust, so Yugoslav Jews were almost completely removed. Just a very small number of the Jewish community survived or were still in the country at the end of the Second World War, and many of them, of course, emigrated afterwards to Israel. At the end of the 1940s, beginning of the 1950s. But nevertheless, the country remained a multi-ethnic state. It was comprised of 6 republics. You can see this in slide number 3. The Republic of Slovenia, the Republic of Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, and Macedonia, what is today North Macedonia. So one country, 6 republics, a little bit like the Soviet Union, where there's one country. The Communist Party was the leader, was the ruling power, but within that there were 15 republics: Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia, and so on. So that was the state of the country. One country ruled by the Yugoslav Communist League of Communists, but in addition to this, 6 republics, 6 separate republics inside the country. Now, in slide number 4, the picture gets even more complicated. This is a map of the ethnic breakdown of the country, and the various colors denote the municipalities where there's a majority of a certain ethnic group. You can see that this picture is very convoluted. Within these 6 republics, spread out across them, there are various nationalities. So there are Croats, there are Slovenes, there are Serbs. But in addition to this, there are Macedonians, there are Bosnian Muslims, converts from the Ottoman period, Slavs, Christian Slavs who converted to the Islamic faith during this long period of Ottoman presence. And there are Hungarians in the north of the country, and so it's an extremely convoluted picture. I guess I would only say 2 or 3 things about this to try to simplify the story. The first is that the largest national group were the Serbs. They're denoted on this picture on this map by the pink color, the color pink. A lot of them living in Serbia, but very many Serbs living outside of Serbia. As you can see from this map, large numbers living in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Socialist Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and also a sizable group of Serbs living within the Croatian Republic as well. Now, what this meant was that the Yugoslav communist leadership, thinking about the best way to keep this country together, and the potential perils, the potential things which could upset the balance between the republics and between these ethnic groups, always believed that the Serbian problem, the Serbian question, was potentially the most serious, the most problematic one, because this national group was the largest within Yugoslavia, and because its number was spread out across the republics. It was as if this group not only has the power to sort of outnumber everybody within the country, but also because they live across these various republics, it will be a problem not just in Serbia, but for these other republics as well. So that was the other issue. I guess the other final point that I would make is that the problem, the issues of complexity, the issues of different nations and different ethnicities living side by side were most complex in the Central Republic of Bosnia. You can see this on the map on slide number 4. It's impossible to draw a line around any of these groups in a clean-cut way. Bosnia is like a mosaic, and it's to a certain extent it still is, or much less so after the wars. I'm sorry to say, in the 1990s. But there are various kind of groups living side by side within this socialist republic. So, for many people, including the communists in Yugoslavia, there was a belief that Yugoslavia, one single state, was the best way to soften potentially these problems between the various ethnic groups. To sort of discount the problem of the Serbs, discount the problems of Bosnia being a very convoluted ethnic map. It was best to sort of keep Yugoslavia together as one state. Now, the outstanding personality of the Yugoslav state was a man called Josip Broz Tito. He's in slide number 5. Now, Tito had been the dictator, had been the ruler of socialist Yugoslavia since the end of the Second World War. He was an old guard communist. He had been a member of the party. He was born, as you can see, in 1893. So already at the end of the Second World War, he was relatively an older man. Most of the communists at this time were much younger people. University students, people in their 20s or their 30s. Tito was already in his 50s at the end of the Second World War. Now you can see there he's in his marshal's uniform. Tito had various offices at various times, and very often he had them all together. So president, prime minister, marshal. But the point is that these were meaningless. He was the source, almost the source of sole power. Within socialist Yugoslavia, within the communist state. Now, Tito was a figure of enormous popularity and prestige, it seems, in socialist Yugoslavia. During the Second World War, the country, of course, had been occupied, it had been dismembered. There were various quisling collaborationist forces, and many of them were very brutal. But eventually, this period of conflict, the force that emerged as the victor out of this period of conflict was the Communist Party, the Yugoslav Communist Party. They waged a kind of national liberation struggle, a partisan war, a military struggle against the occupier, so against the Germans and against the Italians, but also against the native collaborators, the various fascist movements and the various collaborationist groups, and also rival resistance movements. Now, Tito led this movement, and because this movement was, unlike the communist revolution or the communist seizure of power in a country like Poland or Hungary, this had happened as a homegrown movement. The revolution was not a case of the Red Army coming in and forcing communism onto this state. It was actually an example of a homegrown resistance movement, communist resistance movement, sweeping through the country, and at the end of the Second World War, sweeping to power. And so, as a result of this, the Communist Party, at least initially, could be said to have more legitimacy in terms of political and popular support than in countries like Hungary or Poland. And Tito himself was an enormously popular figure. Somebody who had ruled the country since the end of the Second World War, for many people was seen as a father figure, and was a very popular kind of person, a very popular individual, very popular leader. Now, of course, all of this has to be, we have to be cautious when we talk about popularity in an illiberal state, in a dictatorship such as socialist Yugoslavia. Although it must be said that the authoritarian nature of communist Yugoslavia was comparatively much lighter than, say, the Soviet Union or Poland. The country was, because of its break with the Soviet Union, the country was pretty, was more liberal. The system was more relaxed than everywhere, although it was still authoritarian. So with this in mind, one never knows, do we? I mean, it's a little bit like when we see images of Kim Jong-un or a dictator in Latin America, their funeral or, their pageantry. We actually don't know how popular these people are, to what extent people are being coerced to show support, to what extent people are simply doing this because they're worried if they don't, they'll get into trouble. That's always a murky question. But with all of this in mind, there's been some good sort of oral reports and oral history has been written about socialist Yugoslavia, and it does seem that Tito was a figure of genuine sympathy and genuine support. And indeed, when I speak to older Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, some of them hate him, of course, because of what happened, but many of them still speak with a modicum of affection about who they used to call Stari, the old man. Now, if we move to slide number 6, Tito died in 1980, and you can see some images of his funeral there. Pretty much everyone who was anyone on the world stage attended. Because of this unusual position that Yugoslavia occupied in the Cold War, being a non-aligned state, Tito had cultivated very good relations with Latin, global South, what was called then the Third World, Western partners, this kind of thing. He had networks across the world, and many people, pretty much everyone, came to his funeral in 1980. I've put up some YouTube clips. And you can see some very awkward seating arrangements. People, Saddam Hussein, the leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat, sitting next to the Israeli, or sitting on the same row as the Israeli Prime Minister. I think at the time was Golda Meir, but I might be wrong about that. So it was a very awkward. Sort of a situation. Now, when Tito died, it's not that the country immediately started to unravel, but nevertheless, on the one hand, the country lost this figure of great sort of popularity and great prestige, and it was undoubtedly a serious loss for the political system in Yugoslavia. Very, very often, large amounts of power were devolved in Yugoslavia to the various republics. It was very often the case that Tito would be able to sort of step in as the final arbiter of disputes and problems that were taking place within the country. If there was a dispute between Bosnia and Croatia, between Serbia and Bosnia, something like this, Tito could step in. He had the authority. He was seen as a person who could sort of stand above the various kind of lower level disputes and sort of resolve these things in a fair-minded way. So his loss was a big one, but it coincided with a very severe political and economic crisis within Yugoslavia in the 1980s. Yugoslavia had accrued a lot of foreign debt in the 1960s and the 1970s. And during the 1980s, with Tito out of the picture, and with Yugoslavia no longer occupying the prominent role in the Cold War that it had done previously, the IMF and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, and various other Western forces began to call in the loans that they had bestowed upon Yugoslavia. So the 1980s is the beginning of a desperate sort of economic downturn for Yugoslavia, and the country never really recovers from this increasing economic crisis. Now, in the midst of all of this, and I'm really cutting a very long short story, very short now. And if you would like to hear more about this, I urge you to watch the first episode of The Death of Yugoslavia, which, as I say, I've posted online for you all to look at. In the midst of all of this, a figure emerges in Serbia, which, as I mentioned earlier, was the largest. In terms of population, the largest republic and the largest ethnic group within Yugoslavia. A figure emerges who kind of challenges the post-Tito agreement, the agreement that's been in place since Tito died in 1980. This is on slide number 7. A man named Slobodan Milosevic. Now, there was, when Tito died, there was a slogan, which in Croatian would be, in Serbo-Croat, it would be Posle Tita, Tito. After Tito, Tito. Completely meaningless, of course, as so many communist slogans are, or indeed, more generally political slogans, for that matter. But nevertheless, the notion was, the agreement was amongst the higher echelons of the various parts of the Yugoslav Communist Party, that there should not be a figure to replace Tito. There should be no new Tito. He was a one-off. His career spans so much time in Yugoslavia. It was associated with the early period of communism, with the Great Revolution during the Second World War, the partisan liberation of the country, that there should be no replacement for him. And what this meant was that power essentially devolved to Republican level. Each republic had a spell in control of Yugoslavia. They held this presidency, it rotated, a little bit like the European Union. And as a result of this, it was very difficult to make political decisions in the kind of authoritarian and very efficient way, it must be said, that Tito had been able to do when he was still alive. Now, Milosevic emerged into this pattern and kind of promised several things. He called the changes that he would come to make within the country an anti-bureaucratic revolution. He claimed that he was attempting to sort of modernize and to reform the system within Yugoslavia, that he could see it was very unwieldy. He could see that it was in many ways very dysfunctional, and that it needed to be transformed, and he was the person to do it. Remember, as we may know, as you will know now, this is the time of perestroika. This is the time of Mikhail Gorbachev. And for many people, Milosevic, for many people outside of the country, so in the West and this kind of thing, Milosevic resembled, like a Balkan Gorbachev. Somebody who was transforming the country, somebody who was modernizing the country, somebody who was turning the country into a much more sort of sort of efficient, an efficient system. But there were other aspects to Milosevic's program. He was also rallying the Serbs within the country together. There had been a notion among certain Serbian intellectuals, nationalistically minded intellectuals, that the Serbs were victims of Tito and the Serbs were victims of the Titoist state and the Titoist system, that they had been spread out across the country, that their power had been truncated, it had been mitigated, and they were being treated in a very unfair way within this socialist state. Now, it is certainly true that the successive generations of the communist leadership within Yugoslavia identified the possibility of the Serbs coming together within this country as one of the most critical potential problems. That if this was to happen, the very delicate balance between the republics and therefore also between the various ethnic groups could be upset. And this needed to be dealt with. And at the beginning of the system, at the end of the Second World War, there were very many fresh memories of the failures of the other Yugoslavia, the Yugoslavia that had existed in the interwar period. And for many people, there was a sense there that the country had failed because it was dominated by its largest ethnic group, by the Serbs, and that the regime, the people in control, the people in power, in interwar Yugoslavia had not done enough to sort of confront and break down this power. So it's certainly true that did exist, but this kind of nationalist frenzy that came to Serbia in the 1980s, led by Milosevic, was a very kind of self-pitying, a very sort of exaggerated notion of victimhood. It called upon historical references. It talked about persecutions of Serbs. It talked about genocide being committed against the Serbian population, and so it was a very sort of heavy-handed way of looking at things. Now, in slides 8 and in slides 9, you can see Milosevic kind of rampaging through the country as he did at the end of the 1980s, holding rallies, very large political rallies, which were often attended by very many people. I mean, in slide number 8, you can see an image, but also a YouTube clip of a rally that Milosevic held in the southern province of what was then the southern province of Serbia, a place called Kosovo, attended by upwards of 1 million people. And so a very large gathering. And you can also see some of the language that is being used. It's not technocratic language. It's very nationalistically inclined, very nationalistically oriented language. Now, he moves around the country and essentially he's grabbing as much power for himself as possible. And he's doing this not only by rallying the Serbs en masse at the end of the 1980s, so from 1987 to 1989, but he's also imposing, he's also positioning his own people in the various republics and the various political parts of Yugoslavia. So again, if we come back to the way Yugoslavia is structured, as I showed you in slide number 3, one country with 6 republics, and each of these republics had a vote on the federal presidency. Between 1987 and 1989, Milosevic is moving around these various parts of the country, and he's imposing his own people. He's putting his own people in power in each of these republics. It means that not only does he have the mass support of Serbs throughout the country, not just in Serbia, but the smaller groups in Bosnia and in Croatia, but he also has top level control in the various republics, or at least enough of them to impose his will whenever he wants to across the rest of the country. Now, this is protested in the republics of Croatia and Slovenia. Dislike the way the country is turning and want to try to meet at the Politburo, meet at the central party headquarters in 1990 and tried to break down some of Milosevic's power, trying to propose some articles to a reformed constitution, which will sort of break down some of Milosevic's power. This comes to a head at the beginning of 1990. I think it's the 20th Party Congress, when the Slovene and the Croatian delegates attempt to rein back Milosevic's control, Milosevic's power. They propose amendments because Milosevic has now become the all-powerful figure within Yugoslavia. They're incapable of doing this. And eventually, the Slovenes and the Croats decide to walk out of the forum and therefore also walk out of the Yugoslav Communist Party. Now, they hold independent elections in 1990, which of course is something that is happening throughout the bloc, throughout the former communist bloc in the same time, almost exactly the same time. And in both cases, they vote for non-communist alternatives. Again, not unlike what is happening elsewhere in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s. What makes Slovenia and Croatia different is that, or what makes Yugoslavia different, is that you have this very strange circumstance where some of the country is ruled by the Communist Party, and some of the country is not ruled. I.e., Slovenia and Croatia aren't, and other parts of the country are, and this makes for a very weird, very awkward situation. Now, the sequel to these multi-party elections are declarations of independence on the parts of Slovenia and Croatia, and they come in the summer of 1991. Now, this precipitates the beginning of the conflict. The conflicts begin in 1991, and they begin in Slovenia, the most western republic. In June 1991, the Yugoslav army mobilizes and moves into Slovenia in an attempt to bring this republic back into the fold of of Yugoslavia. And this war lasts for about 10 days, and about 60 people are killed, mainly soldiers of the Yugoslav army, the so-called Yugoslav People's Army, the JNA. So about 60 people are killed in these skirmishes. But the Yugoslav People's Army, which is essentially controlled at this stage by Milosevic, withdraws from Slovenia and is willing to let Slovenia go, but regroups its strength, regathers itself within Croatia. Now, I can explain. This will be the last point that I make. If we look at slide number 4, and I can kind of explain exactly why the Yugoslav People's Army do this. If you look at the ethnic breakdown, the ethnic makeup of Yugoslavia, it becomes, I think, quite clear why the Yugoslav People's Army, why Milosevic is willing to let Slovenia go, but is not willing to let, for example, Croatia or other parts of Yugoslavia go. The ethnic map shows that there are large numbers of Serbs living in Croatia and also, of course, living in Bosnia. And what happens essentially in 1991 is Milosevic realizes that his plan A, his desire, his wish to keep Yugoslavia as one country is now over. The country is going to break up. It's going to fragment. So he moves to Plan B, and Plan B is on the ruins of Tito's Yugoslavia to reform a kind of enlarged Serbian state, to attempt to draw borders of the country which will encircle all of the Serbian groups living in Croatia, living in Bosnia. Now, as the country fragments, and it continues to do so, Bosnia, Montenegro, and also Macedonia at this time declare independence. This becomes a much harder task. It means that Milosevic's troops, what remains of the JNA, but also, of course, the paramilitaries that Milosevic is controlling and commanding, must sort of move into these territories and move into Croatia and move into Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the first place violate their sovereignty, violate their declarations of independence, which have been recognized and which have been acknowledged by the UN and by pretty much all of the international community. But they must also start to forcibly remove non-Serbs from areas that they control. Now, the most difficult tasks, the most brutal results of this process, of course, happen in Bosnia. And if you look at this map on slide number 4, you can see why. This would be. The country is so, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, so convoluted, so complicated, that in order to draw a straight line, in order to sort of encircle the Serbs within one country, it's necessary to sort of force out very large numbers of non-Serbs. And it's for this reason, this is one of the key reasons why the conflicts throughout Yugoslavia, but particularly in Bosnia, were so brutal. This was not simply a conquest of territory. This is not simply a matter of controlling as much ground as possible, but it was also a matter of removing not just the people, but their culture, their churches, any evidence, any trace that they had ever been there. And of course, this usually very often meant burning villages, massacring people, carrying out acts of genocide. This has been acknowledged by the UN, happened in the summer of 1995 in a town in the east of Bosnia called Srebrenica. So that's Yugoslavia in a nutshell, a very complicated issue, one that I urge you to sort of look up a little bit more. This very brief lecture has not done justice to the sort of the complicated manner in which the country collapsed, but also in the violence that came along with it. So I urge you to watch The Death of Yugoslavia. If you have time, I urge you also to have a look at some of those lectures from the conflict in the Balkans. But this is essentially a sort of a whistle-stop discussion of how the country broke up and why its breakup was so very violent. Thank you.